the place where the Latino population is growing the most is in the South. So we're talking about Georgia, Tennessee, Alabama, and sort of that southern region. What I also want to say is that in the justice system, Latinx and two-spirited gender expansive youth are the most, overrepresented and receive harsher treatment than white youth. The majority of Latinx youth are arrested for nonviolent offenses, yet many are removed from their homes and sent to locked facilities far from their homes. Secure detention exposes our young people to adult prison environments, not community-based or family healing centered where interventions are proven to be most effective. The human, physical, emotional, mental, spiritual, and economic costs historically and currently paid by Brown and Black communities are unequal to any others. And this is what has allowed these systems to proliferate and sustain their structurally racist systems without accountability. It is really time for us to act and end incarceration for Brown youth.
Thank you. I'm wondering if Senator Chang Diaz or Frankie, you want to add to that?
No, I don't. Sorry.
Okay.
I'm happy
Okay,
to
I will.
chime in, but we also, I'm happy to get deeper into questions. I mean, co-sign on everything that the prior speakers have said before me.
Okay, great. And there's a lot we want to go through, so thank you. I just want to make sure if anyone wants to chime in, like, whatever you got to do, wave your arms, jump in. I don't want to pass everyone. So Marcia, just sort of sticking with where you were going, I'm wondering if you can sort of explain the Latinx data gap and how that impacts youth, not only in places like California or Arizona or Texas or New Mexico, but also in places like Wisconsin or Georgia and the difference.
Sure. So let me start by generally speaking about what we mean by the Latinx data gap. In 2002, a group of us in an organization called Building Blocks for Youth, we released a first report of its kind called ¿Dónde está la justicia? In that report, Professor Francisco Villarreal alarmingly laid out the findings how federal departments and state, county-based youth justice agencies across the entire United States were basically counting Latinos as whites. 20 years later, in an August 2020 report of last year, released jointly by a partnership of the Alianza, where I am the executive director, and then UCLA's Latino Policy and Politics Initiative, we also, put out the same alarming findings that basically Latino youth are still being counted as whites all over this country, including here in California where I live. So you might ask, why is this important? The way that the Alianza likes to break that down is that we talk about, similar to the US Census, if we are not counted, there is no representation, and then there is no resources attached to that population. So basically the erasure of Latinos means that there is no representation of Latinos or Latino advocates sitting at policy discussions to really impact policy changes that are needed for our young people. But also there are no resources attached to our young people and their families. All over the country, there's not one single state that doesn't have a Latino population. You can only look at census maps and realize even the slowest or the smallest populations are North Dakota, South Dakota, but that's alarmingly the fastest growing Latino population in North Dakota, South Dakota. So you can look at every single state and see what the rates are for growth. Last but not least, that as we even talk about changing from status quo systems in place to then downsizing, defunding, or closing down facilities, the absolutely critical need to have that data is so that we can know what needs to get built and in what communities and to what extent. And so it's critical that we act on assuring and demanding an accurate count of Latino youth, not only by race and ethnicity, but also by SOGI, which is sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. And Dr. Threadcraft Walker, would you like to add anything to that as well?
Are you able to hear me?
Oh, you froze a little.
Oh, okay. So sorry. Yes, yes. I think it's the lack of data and metrics. It feeds into just from a practitioner perspective, just an accurate. It's a lack of accurate baseline, and that overlooking that critical piece of data has resulted in Latinx community. Limit a jurisdiction's ability to innovate, to pilot, to evaluate, to
Bad connection.
a really granular level. Oh, goodness.
It's
I
okay.
don't know
Keep
where
going.
yeah,
It's all right.
yeah, so it really prohibits a jurisdiction's ability to innovate and capture that data. So once they are able to get those precious dollars and scarce resources, they're developing programs with a one-size-fits-all approach. You haven't collected the
Yeah. Mhm.
orientation. It doesn't have to be you don't have to wait for data to be available. There are community insights that need to be prioritized and listened to, and a lot of times the communities are raising the signal of things that we will then prioritize in data, which is just a secondary analysis of what the insights that the community already has. And so in addition to that, we know that a lot of our youth, a lot of Latinx youth have multi-system involvement, and so without tracking that data, we don't know how to collaborate with these other systems, whether they be the child welfare system, the immigration system. And again, we really miss a significant opportunity to serve Latinx youth.
Frankie, you want to go chime in?
Yeah, I was gonna mention that the National Center for Youth Law and my team in particular, the Youth Justice Initiative, does work in a number of states, including California. As Marcia suggested, that even we undercount in being a majority Latino state. But also in Colorado, and in Colorado statewide, their data on Latino youth is really low, and I think it gives the misperception that somehow Latinos are not impacted by the justice system. And when asked, law enforcement and state and local leaders have basically said, we don't want to ask the young people, we just guess, because to ask them would somehow disempower them. We don't want to racialize them. And they kind of, flip this narrative where somehow they're being the benevolent law enforcement personnel by not asking the person their race and not assuming. And so just by doing so, assuming that they're white, right? And I think just more broadly speaking, the way that I've experienced it and I understand, the impact is societal, right? I think oftentimes the criminal justice, the conversation is often spoken about in a black-white dichotomy, right? Like as if Native Americans, Latinos aren't impacted. And I think that it really serves to disempower, marginalize, and in some ways disconnect a lot of communities from that conversation, believing that A, that's not their issue, or B, even like you say, the people with the resources, white folks, believing, I don't think it's just them. Like Latinos, their issue is immigration. Black folks, their issue is criminal justice, and it silos us. When I feel like I grew up in Southern California, we all understand as Latinos, as Mexican Americans, Chicanos, we know damn well like we are over punished, over policed, and all that, and it just doesn't reach the national level. And I think it really disempowers communities and disengages communities from coming to this conversation. And I think if we were to speak more honestly and truthfully about who's impacted and how, it would bring more people into this tent and have a more robust and I think an honest conversation about the true impact of the criminal justice system on many communities, not just one.
That's a really good point, and I was gonna, turn to a question about practice, but because of where you just went, Frankie, actually, I'm gonna turn to Senator Chang Diaz and ask, like, given what Frankie was just talking about, now let's think about policymakers. So, like, what's the responsibility? Like, given what we were just saying, where this can so easily fall into a black-white conversation, especially I imagine in a place like Massachusetts, where you're from. I know where I am in Maryland, that's definitely the way that it ends up playing out. So thinking about policy and youth justice, but then specifically how to ensure that Latino youth are seen and heard as part of that process. I'm wondering if you could talk about that from your.
How to make sure that they're heard.
Yeah, and the responsibility of policymakers to look at this and see this as part of their responsibility, that youth justice is not something that is just a side issue that kind of be dealt with by the people in the system, and then that's it.
Yeah, sure. I mean, look, the heart of the answer to your question is it is our responsibility. We ignore it at our peril. I think essential to getting that to happen, right, is starting blocks, right, is the data that we were just talking about previously. You've got to, you can't manage what you don't measure. And so, having that as the building blocks to making a case, right, for policy change, and then driving and assessing policy change, is you need to have those data collection, systems and political will. Beyond that, though, I mean, you can have all the information in the world, and if you still don't have the political will, it's not going to get you to change. So, part of getting to yes on political will is having people at the table of power who are accountable to communities that are directly affected by the dynamics that we've all been discussing. But also building the consciousness that, let me be explicit when I say that, I'm, Black and brown elected officials, as well as technocrats, folks in the executive branch who have that lived experience and who answer to people who are living that experience on a day-to-day basis. But the truth is that actually, I say directly impacted, the truth is that these disparities in the criminal justice system, in our youth serving systems, not too indirectly impact the state as a whole. Whether it's Massachusetts or Maryland or California or any other state, I think about some of the most sort of bedeviling macro level challenges, or sort of foregone opportunities that we have as a state. Just speaking from my experience in Massachusetts, when we look at the things that are holding back our economic prosperity and our economic growth as a state, right? We have a lot of tech sector in Massachusetts, and they cannot hire people fast enough, right? Like the availability of talent and prepared talent is a huge barrier to our growth and prosperity as a state. And I think that getting it right in our youth serving systems is about doing a moral right and a moral justice to our young people. But it's also about unlocking a huge amount of untapped potential to solve other challenges in our state, right? We are not going to get to the kind of workforce preparedness without tapping in to our, fastest growing youth population, right? Our Latino youth. We are not going to get to, we're not going to solve the problems of tech so white if we are not, getting our kids out of the youth criminal justice system and into, better schools. So it's about, solving one problem with another.
Thank you. And I want to turn to Frankie, and then Marcia, I'll turn to you because I want to get your take, Frankie, knowing how much of your efforts are at this very question of how do we get political leaders, elected officials to focus on issues of youth justice and make sure that they're hearing from the voices of young people themselves as part of that, as part of those efforts.
Yeah, well, I'll say it is a challenge, whether you're talking about state leaders or even federal leaders. I think that in California, we've done a good job, building a broad-based coalition led by Latinos. Definitely a lot of the change has been grassroots. A lot of Latino leaders in community organizing, data research like Marcia and lawyers like myself. And I think that one thing we learned early on is we really had to do, it behooves us to do a good job of building up champions and educating the legislature on the science, on common sense things, because oftentimes they're not going to do the job of going out into the community and getting to know things from a real world perspective. If we don't come to them, they're not coming to us, and they do things that oftentimes are well intentioned, but misplaced, misguided, or just not fully informed. And I've seen this play out, both at state and federal level, where they will tinker with laws and do things that where we have the expertise on the ground, this, indigenous knowledge, but they don't make their business oftentimes to know. And we see them moving forward with policies that could be disastrous. And so we have to engage. And that has been something, a concern of mine, I would say a disappointment even. But I get it. Like, not everybody's a community organizer. Not everybody is that social. Some people are good at some things and not others. So, I think what we've done in California is really make it our business to engage them, to educate them, to build them up. And we've, for many years, been able to create champions around youth justice issues. Some have been really quick to pick up. Others have taken years to kind of buy into this idea that, we should be focused on health and development and investing in communities, as opposed to responding to, to the fear and to the politicized, sensational, the crimes that occur. It's a work in progress, and I guess to say, I would like to see more community engagement coming from our electeds, whether they're state or federal leaders. It hasn't happened. I think that what we've done is really come to them and really ask them, to engage with us, to partner with us, and feed them the information, whether it's lived experience, it's data, or others. And I would say the most powerful speakers, I think, are the people with lived experience, because in my experience, I've noticed electeds don't really care to hear from the people with suits as much as they do people on the ground. And ever since we started, with youth offender parole, releasing folks that went to prison for long sentences, as children, as they started coming home, they got into this movement and going back to the Capitol and educating legislators on their experiences. We found that legislators have been very receptive and have been able to change their positions on many things, including ending life without parole, ending direct file, and so many other very seemingly transformative bills that we think are common sense.
Mm-hmm.
So Marcia, I'm going to turn to you, but I'm going to combine it with another question, because we have like 10 minutes left before we want to get into discussion. This is flying by as exactly as I would have imagined would. So I want to do a real quick thing to those who are there. And it looks like there are 35 people participating in this who I'm sure have questions they might want to ask. I would suggest that if you have questions, the chat is available. Put the questions in the chat and hopefully we can get to those. But I'm going to, Marcia, tie this last question in with another one, which is really, Frankie started talking about some things that 10, 15 years ago may not have even been on people's radar. Even in a place like California was doing the opposite, right? They were pushing in the other direction. Now we're seeing these changes. So I'm curious if you could just kind of talk about, in addition to your response to the question about elected officials, but if you could talk about some of the more radical reforms, the attempts at transformation that we're seeing at the local level and at the state level, mm-hmm. to address address issues that are affecting Latino youth in the youth justice system, whether that's in placement or detention or probation, diversion, any of that. I'm wondering if you could comment on that as well as part of that answer.
I probably can't comment it on completely, but I'll try a first attempt, and then I'm sure my colleagues here can add a little bit. Myself, as a family member of loved ones that have been in the juvenile, the criminal, and immigration systems, I have to say that it really it's going to take us, those of us that are sitting here, those of us that are participating in this event, as well as elected officials, to be the champions. Really to be the champions to organize around ending incarceration in all ways. So what I wanted to say previously is that it takes the desire. So there's all these very important issues that the Latino community has taken on, primarily immigration, housing, education, jobs, very important issues. Youth justice has not been on the radar. But when you look at the budget, the misalignment of budget and how much goes to police, how much goes to really keeping these racist institutions in place with status quo, even though the numbers of great reform efforts such as JDAI and the work that the Annie Casey has done to reduce and downsize, and knowing that we could actually get to zero, it's going to take political will of our elected officials. So let me give you just a couple examples. Frankie has been incredibly centered, along with all of his colleagues, around Closing Down DJJ, SB 823, and he can talk more about that. But it took some key champions to come on board with young, formerly system leaders, knocking on all those doors and forcing them, demanding them to close down DJJ. Same thing with the local work that's happening in San Francisco, where by the end of this year, they're going to close down juvenile hall. And here in Santa Clara County, where the majority of young people who sit in detention are Latino youth and girls, we have 0 girls in detention. And by 2024, we want to close juvenile hall down. So that kind of work, it doesn't come just because the community is knocking and banging on the door. It comes because we have champions. So we have board of supervisors. May God rest in peace, Richard Elias, board of supervisor from Arizona, who championed this. David Cortese, who 5 years ago was saying close down juvenile hall here in Santa Clara County. We have champions around the country who want to step up, but remember that you have to partner and center formerly impacted, directly impacted individuals who have the passion and the will to come and join you to do this. So I'm going to stop there and let others share.
Can I jump in on that?
Please,
So,
please do.
you know, speaking from the legislator perspective, I'll just say, you know, that when you have that inside outside game, right, that marrying of the advocate community, the directly impacted constituents, and, you know, policymakers on the inside, that, you know, my experience, that is really when you can really start to rock and roll. And I'll give one example just from my recent experience. We just undertook in the past year or so a major law enforcement reform package in Massachusetts. And one of the provisions in that bill, I was one of the architects of the bill in the Senate. And, you know, one of the things I sort of knew, I already had it in my mind from past work to try and get into the bill, which was doing away with the requirement that we have police officers in schools in Massachusetts. And you know, that was great. We got it into the bill, it made, you know, into the Senate, it made it through conference committee, it's all the way in law now. One of the things that I would not have had the you know, knowledge or presence of mind to push to get into the bill, but because I had this pre-existing relationship that you were talking about, right, with advocates who are closer to the, you know, front line, so they came to me with the idea and to say, look, it's a real problem that we're experiencing, the just sort of bulk passage of data between school districts and police departments about students' personal information, right? Where they live, what language they speak, who they associate with, and this data is just getting sort of just socked away into these databases that the police surveillance centers are keeping in Massachusetts, and it's sort of exacerbating and speeding up, particularly Latinx and immigrant children getting sort of dragnetted by police departments. And, you know, that was a new problem that I would not have known about had it not been for our relationship with Citizens for Juvenile Justice. They put it on the SNAP radar, we got it negotiated into the bill, and now there is a prohibition in law in Massachusetts that unless it is to do with a specific illegal activity, that school personnel may not share data, you know, sensitive student personal information data with police departments.
Thank you. That's a great example. Yeah, go ahead, please jump in.
Just to piggyback on the senator's comments, it's extremely important that we recognize those sources and those that are doing things that are already working. There are some practices, best practices for working with justice-involved youth that we know show benefit. And so making sure that we have an inventory of this information for legislators so it won't be such an abstraction, and we can move navigators, things like trusted messengers. They are more likely to resonate with communities that are underserved. And so we know that these are practices that work, and we want them to be implemented in a way that is responsive and not just in a one-size-fits-all way for the Latinx community, and also making sure that we prioritize community voices and individuals with lived experiences as not just a talking point, but we're not just engaging with them when the project is going to roll out. They should be involved at the very inception to determine if it's a need, all the way through development. In that way, when we prioritize those voices, we are acknowledging that there is more than one traditional source of knowledge.
Thank you. And so we're supposed to be transitioning to kind of a discussion at this point, and we only got to some of our questions, which was inevitable because there's so much to say, and that's okay. I don't see any questions in the chat. I'm going to keep actually churning through what some of the things we thought we might talk about. But please, if there are questions that people have, please do add them. We will continue to monitor the questions that are in the chat. So I do want to maybe just talk about one thing. We talked a lot about, we talked about data, we talked about policy, we talked about politics, we talked about all of that. I'm wondering, getting a little bit into kind of practice. And, one thing that has been increasingly, I think, part of conversation, given how much of conversation about crime, delinquency, inevitably is about accountability. And accountability so often being associated with prisons and jails and punishment and surveillance and all of that. So I'm curious whether we could talk a little bit about restorative justice and thinking about the idea of how it relates to young people who come into contact with the youth justice system, and sort of the promise of that as a potential one way of changing how it is we react when there's harm in our communities and when young people are involved. And I'm wondering, Frankie, if you might want to sort of comment first about that, and then we can, anyone else who has anything to add after that.
Sure. Thank you for that question, Nate. Because, I think that, the idea of restorative justice is one that I think has become, or is problematic for a number of reasons. I think a lot of it has to do with just the systems, the philosophy, the orientation, what are the attitudes and beliefs that drive that system. And on one side you could think about just settler colonialism and this whole idea that manifest destiny gave them this land that was unoccupied, and here are some people that we needed to get out of the way, eradicate, for the sake of having property. And I think that a lot of ways, the way that in particular Native and Latino youth have been treated historically, we continue to see play out through the courts and probation. This idea that it's better to remove the young person from their family, their community, their culture, that somehow it's better to put a kid in juvenile hall, jail-like as it is, than to leave them at home with a single mother in a bad community. And I think that it really comes from this idea of, one, that the system distrusts the community and devalues their strengths in favor of jails and surveillance. And I think that when kids do get in trouble, which kids invariably will, it should be viewed as a teaching opportunity to help them understand healthy behaviors, boundaries, and consequences. And I can say that in my life, that didn't happen. Every time I messed up, I was sent to jail or youth prison. And really what it taught me was, one, I only got to experience my own pain. I was in a cell for, hours, I would say years, and never really understanding the impact that I had on my victims. But also what it taught me was intolerance. The system is intolerant of us. And it's like, go to your cell, go to the hole, go away, that reservation in the desert, meaning prison. And it's just harmful. And so I think that there are a lot of things that we should be doing, like recognizing that, the impact of settler colonialism and its culture of removing young people from their homes and communities is kind of what we're doing. And it's always been that way. And understanding the system needs to own that they're doing that. And they've always done that. And why are we doing that? And secondly, I think that we need to emphasize more community-centered approaches that do bring in the Cultura Cura, the Joven Noble programs, the credible messengers. Because I will say, I never really resonated with corrections officers, no matter how much they try to refashion themselves as the therapist. It was the older homie who was doing good, who owned a house, who had a wife and kids, and no matter what the tattoos or the criminal record might suggest about him, to me, that was a person that I looked up to and still do, right? And so I think that we need to allow community to take care of their own, stop removing kids from their families and communities that is destructive, and instead empower those communities to do more for their own children. And to me, that's restorative, right? Because you don't just restore an individual child, you restore their family, their community, their culture. The entire ecosystem needs to be rebuilt because of centuries of destruction. Otherwise, we can narrowly focus on that individual behavior and say that behavior deserves accountability, or we can look at the big picture and say that the system needs accountability. And I think that is probably a better place to start.
Yeah, thanks, Frankie, for that. I'm glad that you kind of framed it in that way and took it much broader than just, I think, how we might typically think of something like restorative justice as a program or a response in this particular way. We got some questions in the chat, and I want to make sure we get there because this is great stuff. So Representative Lujan asked the question, if we could talk about education and after-school programs and mentorship programs. So I don't know, anyone might want to chime in. Go for it.
I'll chime in. This is my favorite topic, right? It's not, if we really want to get this right, we want to get kids before they get, sort of pulled into the school to prison pipeline and into the youth criminal justice system. So, in my 12 years as a state legislator, I think the single most important thing that I have done to get at the problem of, disparate youthful incarceration or punishment is a K through 12 school funding reform bill, right? To make sure that we are adequately resourcing the system where we want kids to be. And with a special focus on districts that are low-income districts with high proportions of students of color. So, that's the name of the game. That's ground zero. If we can get it right there, we're taking a huge bite out of the whole rest of the system. And I'm so glad that the person who asked this question included, right, in the envelope of the question, the after-school programming and the mentoring, right, because it's not just about the academics, but making sure that there are lasting, consistent adult, loving adult relationships in young people's lives, in addition to or aside from their family members. So, it has to be the complete package.
Thank you. We have another a question, actually two questions, and they both, I think we could probably talk about for a long time. The first one is, can we discuss the link between youth and undocumented status of either their parents or themselves, and how this relates to the school to deportation pipeline? So let's start there.
I could jump in. Some of you may know that I wrote a blog years ago about sort of this myth. I remember being at the Burns Institute and the luxury and honor of being able to work all over the country. And, asking the question of, whenever the question was raised about, oh, what about Latino youth in the youth justice system? And pretty much where everybody would go in this survey is that they would think about that the majority of youth that sit in detention are there because they're undocumented and because they're gang members. Yet the data does not even bear that out, right? Like the data basically shows that the majority of youth that sit in detention are there for low and medium risk offenses. Which means that they could be released. So this question, yes, there are some undocumented youth. There is the intersectionality. There are probably a lot of young people whose parents probably are undocumented and they were brought or they were born here and their parents. But to zero in, I think, and think that the majority of youth that Latino youth that sit in detention, that myth needs to be, removed from the table. And then this notion about gangs, I think that, yes, there are some young individuals that are, and that's an issue that definitely needs to be tackled. And really with formally directly impacted individuals, asking them the questions, going to them, going to the community and being able to respond to those issues, even with after school programs too. I mean, I think that there's there's a lot that gets done for us, but without us sitting at the table to actually come up with the ideas. You know, a lot of stuff gets transplanted from the east to the west, and sometimes the west is saying, well, you know, it really works really well over with you guys, but somehow over here on the west or the southwest, it just really doesn't resonate. So really trusting your local folks. But I do believe that yes, there is a need in some places around the focus to eliminate gang violence. But I would venture to say that it's around uh, uh, um, providing what is needed as opposed to responding in a reactionary way with increased police presence and always sending money to police. We have, I think it's kind of a old school way of approaching this, that you give money to police departments around gang violence as opposed to giving funding to community-based organizations. So I'll leave it there. I'm sure I have other colleagues that can respond to this.
Yeah, I can.
Well,
also,
thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, you know, I'll just, all the research that I've studied, which is a lot on the issue of gangs, and let's just be clear, there are many different gangs. When we say gangs, we automatically go to the highly profile, you know, youth gangs or street gangs. When there's biker gangs, there's prison gangs, there's police gangs. You know, so, but we'll just keep this conversation to youth gangs. And the idea is, you know, or the research shows that the majority of young people in youth gangs are suffering from significant adverse childhood trauma, immaturity, and low self-esteem. And in my view, those things are uniquely developmental issues. You know, and then when you understand in that context the experience of a young person who's coming from another country into a very foreign environment where everybody's seemingly hostile towards you because you're undocumented, I could easily understand how it is that a young person would align themselves, his or herself, with other similarly situated young people, and then be villainized, and, you know, because of our very hyper biased culture, as somehow a threatening group, because you're a group of young black or brown males, in this context, you know, brown males because of immigration. And then if you get arrested in that unit, you're charged with a gang allegation, and that then triggers deportation, you know, removal proceedings. And so it's like you're punishing people for responding, you know, to things that are developmental in nature, and then you basically target them for deportation for being immature, for being traumatized, for being, you know, for having low self-esteem and needing a group to survive. And I'll just say, when I went from Oxnard, California, as a gang-involved youth to UC Berkeley as a transfer student, I was trying to leave kind of my gang lifestyle behind me, only to get to the University of California and find that all these white kids have gangs of their own, AKA frats and sororities. And these frats in particular are selling drugs, committing sexual violence. You know, they're identifying by colors and signs and groups, brawling and fighting in the street like drunk idiots with each other. And never once did I see the police come and arrest them, charge them with gang prosecution, you know, enhance their punishments. But when, you know, because we have institutions that protect these people. But when it's black and brown kids who do the same thing, then we're trying to send them to prison for many years, or we're trying to deport them. And so my main point is that this is an issue of immaturity. We see it; it's a universal, cultural universal. But when we see it, you know, happening with vulnerable immigrant youth, it's viewed as an opportunity to get rid of them and send them back to, you know, their home countries.
Thanks, Frankie. I fear that my job is to like end this now because of time, but instead I'm just going to keep asking questions until I guess the technology tells us we're supposed to leave. So there's so many. All of a sudden, we've opened the floodgates of questions. So I want to make sure. I feel like I'm throwing out some red meat with this one. So Senator Rodriguez is asking the question: how do we work with local, state, and federal system to support community organizations that are best equipped to serve young people, since so much of the money always goes directly to the system and all of its manifestations? So I'm sure you all have a take on that question.
I've got a quick
Go
one
ahead.
here.
Yes, Senator.
We're sort of midstream on in Massachusetts. One of the bills that I've been pushing for a number of years is called the Justice Reinvestment Act. Here in Massachusetts, and it's actually I'm gonna be embarrassed that I'm not remembering. It's one of the southwestern states actually that this is modeled after, where because of a criminal justice reform bill that we got passed back in 2018, we're actually seeing a steady decline in overall incarceration rates in Massachusetts. And so what this Justice Reinvestment Act aims to do is to put in place an intentional system for grabbing half of the savings from the decreased incarceration rates, putting it into a trust fund that is specifically dedicated so that it doesn't just, sort of get, absorbed by osmosis back into the system. But put it into a trust fund which is governed by a board of people who come from the populations that we are trying to serve with this reinvestment and restorative justice model. And there's language that's put around this trust fund that it is dedicated to economic empowerment grants and dropout prevention and intervention frontline organizations. And it's a grant making fund so that we are being intentional again about redirecting the savings and not just plowing them back into building a new prison or continuing to employ a law enforcement workforce that we have demonstrated reduced need for.
Thank you. Anyone else want to chime in on that?
I want to say that those that most need the funding are grassroots organizations that rarely ever have the structural or the structure that they need in order to then apply for this funding. And so we have such beautiful strengths in our community. I could think of at least 10 off the top of my head that are normally considered, that live in our communities but never get funded. They always work as volunteers, but we no longer can do that, right? Not even our directly impacted young people. No, we have to pay them to be able to sit at these tables and be involved in policy development. Our jefes de danza, our spirit leaders, all these different individuals that have been long-term giving to our communities, but
one more minute and then I'll jump into intro while people give them a second to break between one session and another.